this week's video, I'm going to be installing a transmission oil cooler. There are other ways to control your automatic transmission temperatures. I'll be going through the install from start to finish. I'll go through all the tools that I use. So if you want to skip to the install, there's time codes, there's chapters. On top of the install, I'm also going to go through why you might want an automatic transmission cooler, why I wanted the automatic transmission cooler, the alternatives to getting the automatic transmission cooler, or different combinations of things you can use outside of getting a bolt-on transmission oil cooler. Two other main options you can use to lower your transmission temperatures. I'll go through the pros and cons of using different combinations of these, and then I'll go through what I've got and why, and what I plan to do about it in the future. So the Mazda BT-50 and the Ford Ranger use the 6R80 transmission from Ford. It's a 6-speed automatic, and where it comes into trouble is when you have a really heavy load or you start towing things. Now the reason I went for the aftermarket oil cooler, although I have no intention of towing, and that's not how I'm setting up this vehicle. When I purchased the car, all it had was a tow ball package and a bull bar. So that gives me an indication that possibly the previous owner had been living out of a caravan because there were no modifications done to the car. I feel like maybe it was used for towing, but I found it at 35,000 kilometers, so it should be in pretty good condition regardless of whether it was used for towing or not. However, as I look to add weight and possibly get larger tyres, which is sort of the same as changing your gearing, then I could be seeing a rise in these temperatures, and I'd rather just get on the front foot and stop any future issues now. It'll put me in good stead if one day I decide to start towing with this car, then I've already done a lot of the hard work. On top of this, once I do this oil cooler change, I plan on doing a transmission fluid flush. What this will do will give me a clean slate of fresh transmission fluid from the point that the aftermarket oil cooler was installed. So the 6R80 transmission does not have an oil cooler, so to speak. It has a heat exchange unit. So what this heat exchange unit does is it uses coolant to take away some of the heat from the transmission oil. Now there are reported failings of this heat exchanger where coolant will start seeping into the transmission oil. You'll get contamination of your transmission oil. What the shops say that sell these automatic transmission oil coolers, they say that that is a possible fail point. The coolant can seep into your transmission fluid, contaminate it, and because coolant is basically water, it makes it a bit milky and it's no longer fully lubricating. I don't think this is a common issue. I'm not sure if it's ever happened, but I guess theoretically that is true, that it could happen. So that is one advantage of this oil cooler kit, is that it actually removes the heat exchanger, so you never have that cross-contamination potential. I don't think that's very common, but it's possible. The other thing to note with the transmission is that it has a thermal bypass valve. This will only allow the transmission oil to flow into the heat exchanger for cooling above a certain temperature. Now there's no really solid information on what this temperature is. I've heard it's about 85 degrees Celsius and other people say it is up over 90 degrees Celsius. I've been monitoring the transmission fluid temperatures with the Ultragauge, and it generally on a cold day will hover in the low to mid 90s. On a hot day it will approach 100, and going through sand or driving it really hard it can go over 100. The highest I've seen it on this car, which is quite a lightweight car, is off-road at maybe 101 degrees. My best guess is that that thermal bypass is opening, allowing the transmission oil to cool somewhere between 85 and 90 degrees. In cooler temperatures, it maintains that at 95 degrees Celsius. Now, that thermal bypass valve is there for a reason, because you want the transmission fluid to be warmer, it operates better, and it shifts smoother at a higher temperature. So Ford have put that in to increase the temperature to a certain limit before they start to cool it and try and maintain that limit. The problem is they can't maintain that limit with the heat exchanger, especially when people are towing, driving through hilly terrain, or driving off-road. The heat exchanger is not enough to maintain that temperature. Option 1 is buying this aftermarket transmission cooler. The benefits being that you remove the heat exchanger completely, so you eliminate the cross-contamination potential of the coolant to transmission oil. Now the limiting factor with the cooling here is that it won't flow through that oil cooler until the temperature of that thermal bypass valve is reached. Now nobody seems to really know what that actual temperature is. What I'll be able to do by installing this aftermarket oil cooler, I'll be able to see in a cold environment, it's winter at the moment, when the transmission temperature plateaus using the Ultragauge, and then I'll know for my bypass valve at what point it's opening, because I think that'll be the exact point plus maybe 1 or 2 degrees above that. The oil cooler will be more than enough to maintain it at that point. So the downsides to option 1 you do partially block the intercooler on the front. I don't think it's going to be an issue. If it is, I'll have to look at getting an aftermarket intercooler that is a bit larger, that sits behind, in which case you've solved both problems but spent more money. You have this aftermarket oil cooler, but it won't start operating until 85 or 90 degrees. I personally don't consider that a downside because I'm not towing anything. That is the optimum temperature for the oil to be at, so that is exactly what I want. I want it to maintain somewhere between 85 and 90 degrees. For people that are towing, it might not be enough for the oil cooler to maintain that due to the extra load, whereas if it started cooling earlier, it would give a lot better performance. So option 2 is getting an aftermarket thermal bypass valve that is in the open position all of the time. The benefit to this is that even if you don't get an aftermarket oil cooler, you are sending oil through the heat exchanger all of the time. You don't need as big an oil cooler because that cooling through the heat exchanger is working all of the time and from an early stage of the drive. The downside is you don't have any extra power in your cooling if you're doing a long drive towing. It might be irrelevant after an hour because you've been driving for so long that heat exchanger might not be enough to keep up anymore. Another downside is that you're no longer bringing the automatic transmission oil up to the ideal temperature range. The manufacturer wants this to work at a certain operating temperature. You might not achieve that anymore, especially when you're not towing. Another positive of the bypass valve in the fully open position, if you are checking your transmission oil level, you don't have to get the transmission oil up to temperature, get a proper reading on the transmission oil dipstick. If you have that valve open all the time, then you can get proper readings with your dipstick 100% of the time. You don't have to take the car for a warm-up. You don't have to worry about burning your hands trying to get that dipstick in and out. It's a very poor position where the transmission filler and dipstick are located. It's up near the exhaust. The third option that is common in the BT-50s, Rangers and Everest is that you get an enlarged oil pan which holds an additional 3 litres. This is better cooling, better dilution. A lot of these drain pans also come with a drain plug, which is missing on the factory drain pan. You have to undo 20 odd screws just to get rid of all the liquid in the drain pan for your transmission. If you buy this aftermarket one, you have more liquid. You have to change it less regularly. Not that you should have to change it much at all. And you also get a drain pan in case you do have to drain it. It's just a lot easier. Now, obviously you can combine all 3 of these. You can go an aftermarket oil cooler with a permanently open flow bypass valve, and you can go the additional pan. So what I've decided to do is just get the aftermarket oil cooler. The reason I've done this is because I eliminate the heat exchanger completely. I'm getting way better cooling at the point that that thermostat opens. It should maintain basically that temperature the whole time. Because I'm not towing and I'm trying to keep this build as low as possible. So that gives me the benefit of having automatic transmission oil at the correct temperature, which is best for shifting, but not letting it rise any higher, which can cause damage to the solenoids and the rubber seals inside the transmission. After I fit this, I plan on doing a transmission oil change with a kit that I've bought, which does include the bypass valve, but I'm not going to fit the bypass valve because I want to get some readings after long trips and see how effective the transmission oil cooler is. That gives me the option, if the transmission cooler isn't as effective as I would have liked, to fit the bypass valve later. So step 1 for me is just fitting this transmission oil cooler and doing a flush with a kit with a new gasket and a new filter. When you do a flush, you're not replacing all of the transmission fluid. You might replace about 60 or 70% of it, but there's always some in the transmission itself, in the torque converter. So you can't get all of it, but you replace about 70% of it, and that is good enough. If that turns out to be ineffective, then I have the fully open bypass valve to install, in which case I'll be draining all of it again after it's been worked through the system and installing new fluid, putting the bypass valve in with the oil cooler, and everything should be 100% perfect after that. But I'll always have it there just in case I need it. I'm not going to go for the deeper pan. Obviously, for me, it's overkill and it's just another purchase that I'd have to make. It doesn't really suit what I'm trying to achieve. Because I'm buying a filter kit anyway with a gasket and a new filter, it's only an extra $60 odd to get this bypass valve. That's why I've gone for that as a second option. If you're someone that tows a lot, you could combine all 3 of these. If you want the cheapest option, buy the bypass valve by itself and rely on the factory heat exchanger to cool down the transmission oil better because it's operating all of the time. Another downside of only installing the oil cooler is that you are keeping that control valve in there. It has been known to become faulty and get jammed in the closed position. If this happens, you won't have any transmission oil flowing through your heat exchanger or aftermarket cooler or whatever you have installed because the ports will be blocked. The reason I'm not worried about this is because I've got the Ultragauge, I'll set an alarm so it will alarm me if that automatic transmission temperature ever goes above 102 degrees Celsius, whereas your car won't alarm you until your automatic transmission temperature goes above 130 degrees Celsius, which is way too late. Because I've got the Ultragauge installed, I've set an alarm 1 degree above the highest I've ever seen before, which was off-road, which I don't expect it to reach once the oil cooler is in. That alarm will go off. That will allow me to nurse the car somewhere safe, and I'll know instantly that the thermal bypass valve is blocked, and then I'll be able to change it out for the bypass valve that is in the constant flow position. I don't know if that's really an issue or if that's just something the shops tell you to try and sell you these things. So take it all with a grain of salt, but technically, again, it is possible. The more you tow and the heavier you tow, the more likely it will be that you have small metal shavings, things from solenoids and gears and stuff that find their way through the liquid. They can block that drain plug, in which case you will have overheating. If you're worried about that, I recommend getting an Ultragauge or scan gauge or something where you can set an alarm so you pick up the issue a lot earlier than the car will warn you about. The price was $686, which I thought was reasonable enough. So this is the entire kit as it comes. I'm just going to weigh this now. At the end, I'll weigh everything that hasn't been used, plus the heat exchanger that we're about to remove. And the difference between that will be how much weight we've installed to the car. 6.265 kilos is how much the kit is at the start. So on top of what I weighed in the kit before, I've also used a handful of cable ties, and I used the two M6 nuts to bolt the bottom of the bracket on instead of the supplied Tech screws. Before we get into it, we'll just have a look at the kit, see what's inside. The kit that I've gone for is a dual plate oil cooler from Wholesale Automatics. It has a good reputation, it was well priced, and it had really good instructions to follow. So in the kit we have instructions. Instructions come with a quick summary and a detailed summary. If you don't like reading, they've also uploaded a video of a full install that they've done. In the kit there is a Land Cruiser. So the kit that I've got has come with automatic transmission fluid. This is helpful if you need to top up the fluid at the end of the job. This little hose which will link the front cooler to the back cooler, because this is a dual cooler unit. This long 5 metre bit of hose that will go to the transmission where the heat exchanger gets removed, this will connect to. This J pipe here will close off the cooling system that we're removing as we remove the heat exchanger. We've got 2 unions to fit the hose to. Then we get a variety of hose clamps, a spacer if necessary, you might need this to mount the cooler, and some Tech screws to mount into the bottom of the cooler. We're going to be removing this so we can access behind the front left splash guard. Just letting you know so you can loosen these before you jack your car up. We're just removing the trim at the front here to get access. Under here is where we're going to be bolting our transmission oil cooler. These clips, you need to lift them up. You can use 2 small flatheads. You can use trim removal tools, whatever you need to do to get this up and off. Just pull those out like that, keep them somewhere safe. Don't eat them. No, you can eat them if you want, I don't care. Once we've removed all the clips from the top, these clips here need to be pushed in, and that will remove this plastic part from the grill part. So I'll try and do this one with one hand. All you have to do is push that up and it will pop out. So everyone's grill will be different. I've got a bull bar on. I didn't have a lot of clips as such, but this bracket here, that is a 10mm socket head. That is preventing this from lifting. Got to unclip the spotlights, and then it was the same on the other side, which will allow this grill to come out. Just got to undo these bolts. Your setup might be a little bit different. With the cooler in this orientation, with this bracket, which is the bottom, facing towards you, I'm going to go from the top of the front cooler to the bottom of the rear cooler. That's how it will sit in the vehicle. Slip on your provided hose clamp. Once you've got your hose clamps in the orientation you want and tightened them, cut these tyres, run this length of hose out, try and get rid of all the coils, and we'll attach either end to here and here. Then we'll feed this down through the grill, put this in position. I'm just going to put the 2 bottom ones facing down and the 2 top ones facing up, so I can access these from underneath the car by removing a plate. I can access them from the top. So So once you've fed the hoses down, you can locate the oil cooler bracket behind this cross member here. There's a hole about 100 mil to the right of the bonnet lap, and that's where it sits. And then underneath we'll have 2 tech screws we have to drill in. This hole is pre-existing, and you use this little M6 bolt here. If your grill doesn't go on the cooler in this position, then we use this spacer here. What this will do is angle the cooler like that. So instead of sitting out here, it'll be like that. So what I'm going to do is mount it with this bolt in. I'm not going to drill the bottom yet. I'm going to just try and get the grill back in, make sure the grill fits with this cooler here, and only after I've made sure that the grill fits will I drill the bottom, making sure this is all square. It's M6, 10mm head. Every car is different, but this is a 2015 BT-50. I think just because of the design of the grill and the curves that they go for, this is actually contacting here, so I'm not going to be able to install it like this. I'll need to use the spacer. So the spacer will go on the inside of this cross member, and that will push this whole assembly back that distance. And then the supplied bolt is a longer bolt that will go through and thread into the bracket. So that is what it looks like at the moment. I'll just install this and then I'll show you what it looks like afterwards. So here it is now. That's where the grill sits, and you've got that space now in between with the spacer on the inside here. It's not going to affect the performance at all, and I'm not worried about what it looks like because you can't see it anyway. But there is a possibility that it will affect any aftermarket intercoolers if I was to try and upgrade in the future. So I'll just have to be careful about any intercoolers that I select in the future and make sure I get pretty good measurements before I order anything to make sure it fits behind here. But it's important to check your grill fits before you go ahead and drill the 2 bottom screws, because putting the spacer in might affect how your bottom screws fit. Looking up at the cooler from the bottom, you've got that top screw in. I've used a spacer on mine, you might not have. Now basically you just want to get this upright. So once you make sure that your bracket is straight where you want it, you can drill through with the provided tech screws here. This crossbar here is C-channel, just make sure that none of your accessories have cable running in here before you drill. Personally, I'm going to go through with a nut and bolt with a nylock nut, and the reason being is so that I can paint the hole to try and prevent any rust from forming. I don't really want to use tech screws, so I'd rather nut and bolt it. So I had these lying around. So most installs, you just go through with the tech screw. That's how they do it in the shop if you took it in. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I just prefer a nut and bolt, especially when I've got them lying around. I'm just going to drill and paint that. These holes are drilled and painted now, so I'll mount this up and do them up. They won't have to come out again. And just on that top bolt, I'm just going to put Loctite 243 in it. These bottom ones I won't, because I've got a nylock nut on the other side. From the cooler, you want a nice sweeping bend. This cable tied off, we're going to run towards the left-hand side of the car, because that's where the heat exchanger is, and that's where we're going to connect our hoses. And then the instructions say to go over the chassis. So I did try that. I tried to go up and over there, but I just couldn't get it through. I think there's too much stuff in the way, so I've gone under. I cut this bit out with the intention of coming through here, but then when I was tying it up, I noticed that your petcock to drain your coolant is here, so I didn't want to block that. Not that it would be hard to remove if you did tie them here, but I decided just to jump on the outside of this plastic guard. You got to be careful. Depending on what bash plates you have, this might not work for you. So I did this, and then I held up the bash plate to make sure it fits, and it does. Not only does it fit, it actually hugs this and sort of protects it and holds it up in there, which will help stop vibration. So that worked out really well. Then I've put a cable tie on here. This is through 2 holes in the chassis, but it's not tightened down all the way to the chassis because I don't want any tight bends. So that cable tie is not cranked up completely, it's just holding it up and out the way. And then just running my hand through here, I made sure there was no twists. And that hose is still a loop. I haven't made any cuts yet, so we still have the full length of that hose. So the hose has come through here. Taking this off, just Phillips head clips. This here is just the drain vent of my ProVent 200, so you might not have this. The other reason we need to take this off is to access some coolant lines that we're about to disconnect from the heat exchanger. So your oil cooler lines will come up here. I've just tied them up as per the instructions to this line here, which means you still have access to your oil filter for doing servicing. Now this isn't final, these are just loose at the moment. Before we tie up too much, we need to start looking at removing this heat exchanger and clamping these coolant hoses. This is the heat exchanger. We've got 2 coolant hoses. We're going to clamp them with hose clamp pliers. Then we're going to remove these hose clamps and remove these coolant hoses from the heat exchanger. So you want a drip pan, an oil drain pan beneath. Whatever is from your hose clamp pliers forward is going to come out when you remove these. You can undo all this and drop this propeller shaft down. I'm going to attempt to do it with it in, just to show you that it can be done without removing this. Once these hoses are off, we have a 10mm here, or you may have a Torx bit. I've got 10mm. This bracket, just take that bolt off. We take those two split pins out, and then there's two 10mm bolts on the top of this heat exchanger. So just so you can see above the heat exchanger, the two bolts that we're loosening now. I just have a selection of hose clamp pliers here. So you can try and clamp these coolant hoses from this splash guard that we've removed, or you can go underneath and try and clamp them closer to the heat exchanger. So I've got the first set of hose clamp pliers on, doing the hose towards the front of the car, and then I've got this off just using bullnose pliers. I put the hose clamp pliers on here. It sort of blocked my access to try and get this clamp off. This hose clamp I'll put from underneath, clamp this, take this off. Just trying to work this off by pushing it with a pry bar on each different edge that I can get to. And then I will drain it into here. Just keep these bolts because we'll reuse them. One of them will clamp the J-pipe that we use for the two coolant hoses. And this bolt on the bracket we'll reuse because we'll reuse that whole bracket. This is where our two unions will fit for the new oil cooler lines, and this bracket will help hold them in. So when I take the heat exchanger out, you might have a little bit of transmission oil coming out. That is where our new unions go. So I'm going to put these in. Make sure you have two O-rings on each one with these on the end to help prevent any flow from coming out. So I'll have these pre-prepared. When I take that bracket out and work this heat exchanger out and trying to fit it past the drive shaft, then I'll try to get these in as soon as possible and have the drain pan underneath. So as you remove the heat exchanger, you will have transmission oil come out. We will need to refill at the end of the job, as well as coolant for the coolant that was lost. Now up here, I'm going to fit these, and then I'll fully remove this from the car. We've got these pushed in as far as they go. We've got two rubber O-rings on there. Make sure those surfaces are meeting completely there. Pushed them in all the way. One of them was quite difficult to get in. I've got those end caps on just to prevent any further leaks, and I've given it a quick wipe down with paper towels just to try and clean it all out. You'll also want to go and spray degreaser, which I'm going to do. I'm just going to get these brackets on first. This bracket now holds these in place, and that's what our oil cooler will connect to. But before I do that, these coolant lines, we need to complete that circuit, and we do that with this J-pipe. So I'm going to push the J-pipe in there. So put your hose clamps on. The pipe will get clamped down to the body of the transmission with this clamp here. Once you've got that in with your hose clamps done up properly, you can remove your hose clamp pliers. Now your J-pipe's on, two hose clamps are on. See how that's sitting ready for that P-clamp to go on there? To avoid preloading on the tubes where they're trying to twist, just twist them around until you get the J-pipe sitting nicely. That way there's no preloading, and this will sit in nicely without it trying to force its way out. That clamp just uses one of the old 10mm that was in there. These two hose clamps, 8mm socket. Got our J-hose on now, P-clamp done up. I did it this way so the bolt was on the bottom just to keep it away from the drive shaft, but it does actually go the other way. And you just want to make sure you got gaps between your body and transmission. You don't want it to be touching anywhere. If you flip this the other way so the bolt's on top, you'll actually get this further away from the transmission. It'll just be a little bit closer to here. But if you can't get it away, then that's something you can consider. This one has a bit of play, so I'll tie that off. With the J-pipe on, the coolant lines out of the way, we can feed this loop in. We can tie it up here to keep it away from the oil filter. So just at the union here, here's our oil line. I've tied that up completely now, away from the oil filter. And this is why it's important that you don't chop this loop beforehand, because it is basically the perfect length, minus about 60mm, maybe off cut. So you want to get this in, nice smooth bend. This is easier with two hands, but what you want to do is get a nice smooth bend in here. Try and put your finger where you want to make your cut, and then cut the hose. Once you cut the hose, peel the split conduit back, fit this, and attach it to one of the unions. So guys, I contacted Wholesale Automatics as well, and I just verified that it doesn't matter whether your hot side of the transmission, which is the lower port, goes to the back or the front cooler on the dual plate setup. There is a marginal difference, so if you're really worried about it, the lower union, which is your hot side, should be going to the cooler on the back, which is the closest to the intercooler. And then do the same for the other end. If there's any excess length, cut it back a bit. And that is the fitment part complete. So I'm just going to cut the hose with this. These are conduit cutters or pipe cutters. So I fit the top one, peel the conduit off. As you fit the next one, try to get the hose on. Do this up, and then you can fit this conduit back up. Now, after you've done that up, just make sure you've got good clearance around your drive shaft. Next job will be filling up the coolant and transmission. Alright guys, that's the installation part of the transmission oil cooler done. The next part is arguably the most annoying. So you're not quite done with the hard work yet, because filling up the transmission fluid in the Ford Ranger BT-50s with the 6R80 transmission is a pain in the ass. So I'll just play a bit of footage that I took with the engine cold just to show you the location of it. So where we've been working on one side of the transmission, just on the other side, this is your filler, and it's also your dipstick for your transmission. Now the issue here is, it is very close to the exhaust. So we'll take this out and we'll have a look at the dipstick. I assume it's never been undone, and it's very tight. I've had to lever two spanners together and use my foot to get it undone. Because of the position, it's really hard to get to, and it was extremely tight. So built in here is the dipstick. So after you've been for a drive, you'll have to get this out, and you'll have this dipstick here. Now you'll see two cross-hatched areas here, A and B. When the car's hot, we need to be at B, at the top of B preferably. So you'll need to reach up here, dip that in until it bottoms out. So you can see that's in a pretty good spot, but where it gets worse is that you are meant to check the transmission fluid at 91 degrees Celsius. So we'll just have a look at two snippets. One is a 6R80 workshop manual, and the other is just a Haynes manual for the Ford Ranger. First up, 6R80 transmission workshop manual. It says that the vehicle is safe to drive when the fluid is in the cold level range. And it also says that we need to go through all the gears, hold them for 5 seconds. Down here it explains that there is two areas on the dipstick. We want it to be at the higher level of the dotted marked area when the transmission fluid temperature is at 91 to 102 degrees Celsius. So all of this is kind of key to remember. We'll go back over it. And up here it just states that you have the engine idling while you're checking it, and you have it in park. Here we have the Haynes manual, and this also says that we need the temperature up to about 85-90 degrees, but where it differs is saying that you need to get to the top of A. I think that is incorrect for the type 1 dipstick. If you have the type 2 dipstick, then that's correct. But for the type 1 dipstick, you want to be to the top of B. So I just want to highlight here where it says it takes 400 mils to go from the bottom of the hatched area to the top. That is 100% accurate with what I found. As I was filling it up, I did it in 200 mil increments, and it did go up roughly half a hatched area at a time. And then I even took out 200 mil, and it dropped by that same amount as well. So just in case you want to know how far it is, that's pretty accurate. So as you can see, both manuals and every other manual I've found online says that you have to check the transmission fluid temperature at 91 degrees or operating temperature 85 degrees. So the two manuals differ there, but I'll definitely recommend if you have your transmission temperature up at 90 degrees, that you have it reaching the top of that B hatch mark, not the A hatch mark. I think the Haynes manual is a little bit wrong there. Anywhere in that B range, when it's really hot, I think will be fine. I don't think it's going to make too big a difference. It's worth noting that the cold readings is a range of 32 to 41 degrees or something like that. It's not enough to just turn the car on and check it, because it could be 14 degrees or 20 degrees. Their cold range is about 30 to 42 degrees, so you want to get it up to that range. Just as a point of reference, when I started this up, the transmission fluid was 18.5 degrees. 10 minutes of idling only got it to 28 degrees. So you really want to go for a drive. Just a quick drive. I did about 300 meters down the road, and the transmission temperature was up to 34 degrees. It was the perfect temperature for checking cold. So before you go for a drive, you want to top up your coolant. You fill the coolant to between the minimum and maximum line. If you're looking at the coolant after you've gone for a long drive and it's just over the max, it doesn't matter. That's just because it's expanded. When it's cold, you want it in between the min and the max. The next thing you want to do is get underneath the car and get a 19mm spanner or socket or whatever you can fit in there. Break the tension on the automatic transmission, because it could be really, really tight. You don't want to be mucking around with the car on. So once you've broken the tension, there's no point looking at the reading with the car off. It's irrelevant. it'll be sitting a lot higher than it will when the car is running. So what you want to do is start the car up, handbrake on, go through park, reverse, neutral, drive, and hold each one for 5 or 6 seconds, and then get it all the way back into park, and then jump back underneath, and with the dipstick, check your transmission level. So what we're doing with this cold check is making sure that you have enough oil in there to compensate for the fact that when you go for a long drive to bring it up to temperature, the oil will start to fill 5 meters worth of hose plus the 50 centimeters of hose between the cooler as that valve opens and you get it up to temperature, which will then drop it in the transmission. And this is why you definitely need to top up at the end. So according to the manual that we looked at before, you want to be checking the transmission between 91 and 101 degrees Celsius, and you want it to be at the top of that hatched B mark on the dipstick. Because we have the cooler in now, the fluid isn't going to get to 91 or 101 degrees Celsius. All you need to do is get to a point where the transmission temperature is capped, which means that it has started to flow through the oil lines to the cooler. That is what we're trying to accomplish, is to get it all through the oil lines to the cooler, and then you can come back and check it. Don't turn the car off, leave the car running. Come back and check the levels with the car hot. For me, I had it in the garage. It was idling. The transmission temperature was about 80 degrees Celsius, and that is the temperature I had when I was checking the fluid hot, because that's as hot as it could get when it was idling. So after going for a long drive and getting it up to temperature, pulling back into the garage, the car idling in park, got underneath and I checked it again, and I ended up having to add in another 450 to 500 mil. So for me, that was a total of about 1.45 litres that I had to add in, but you can't add all of that in at the start. You can only add a bit, and then you need to go for a drive to let the transmission lines fill up, and then you have room to add more and get it up to that B mark. So I had the transmission temperature at 81 degrees Celsius, and I got the fluid level up about 3/4 up to that B hatch mark, because I wasn't quite at the 91 to 100 degrees that they recommend being the top of the hatch mark. I did about 3/4 of the way up. Pretty happy with that for 80 degrees. I think that's bang on. As well as that, you also need to check your coolant after a drive. So we've already topped it up cold, but as you drive, have the heaters on, cranked, make sure your car gets hot, and then when you get back and the car's cooled down, don't open it when it's hot. You can check your coolant again, because some air might have been bled through the system, in which case the coolant might have dropped in the reservoir tank. So you can top that up again after it's cooled down. So that's it. Once you got your temperature spot on, put your dipstick back in, put your transmission filler plug in, do it up with a 19mm, reasonably firm. It's meant to be 35 Newton meters, but you won't fit a torque wrench in there. Once the car cools down, give everything a degrease. So you've topped up your coolant, you've degreased, and you can whack your bash plates back on. Everything should be fine from here on in. Originally, I was trying to do it all with welding gloves, but it's way too difficult. I ended up using a pair of gloves like this. I had a long sleeve shirt on for protection. I managed to get up near the exhaust. I found it a lot easier doing that than trying to fumble around with welding gloves. I got pretty skinny arms and that, so it was pretty easy for me to get up there. If you can't quite get your arms up there properly away from the exhaust, you'll have to use welding gloves. I did manage to do it with welding gloves. It's just more awkward trying to dip the dipstick in and out and get an accurate reading without dropping it or fumbling it or ruining the reading on the way out. And when you're checking it, do your topping up, or if you overfill, drain it while the car is on. Don't turn the car off to try and fill it up, because if you turn the car off and you've got the transmission filler plug out, you're going to have transmission oil coming out of that plug, because when the car's off, that level raises significantly. It's only when the car is on that actually sits down a bit further in the transmission pan. I actually overfilled at one point, and then I had to subtract about 200 mil from the reading just to get it spot on. So I was filling it up with the car on, getting it out with the car on. The exhaust wasn't too big an issue for me, but definitely be careful. Alright guys, so for the final weights, we have everything from the kit that didn't get installed and everything we've removed, like the hose clamps and the 2 bolts from the heat exchanger and the heat exchanger itself. Whatever else was in the kit that didn't get used is on the inside here, as we'll chuck them on. And the difference between this and the addition of the other 2 weights will be what we've installed on the car. So there we go, 2.566 kg. So going for a drive to get the transmission up to temperature, I got it up to 100 k's for 20 minutes. I went up through the hills. The hottest the transmission gets now is about 85 degrees Celsius. Previously, doing that sort of work through the hills and stuff, it would have been approaching 100, maybe just beneath that in winter, might have been 97, 98 degrees Celsius. So that's about 10 to 13 degrees better off. Keep in mind that that's not a limitation of the oil cooler. That's because that thermal valve is only opening at what I assume is 84 or 85 degrees Celsius. The oil cooler is maintaining that level completely. It's not letting it climb any higher. So for me, someone who doesn't tow, the fact that the cooler can maintain that temperature at 85 is perfect. It's getting it up to the temperature that the manufacturer wants. It's good for shifting, and it's not letting it go any higher than that. All right guys, that sums up the BT-50 transmission cooling. There's a few different options there for you. I'm gonna take one of the options with one as a backup. The transmission cooler, does it work? The initial testing that I've done, it absolutely works. It stops that temperature dead at about 85 degrees when you're driving. It does go up a little bit when you slow down, but that's just because there's no airflow. I think this is one of the best mods you can do. If you're not towing, you probably don't need the constant flow valve and you don't need a deeper pan, but it wouldn't hurt to get an oil cooler kit just to maintain those temperatures. I hope this has been of some help, and have fun trying to fill up your transmission. You get contaminate. Transmission has a thermo. So I just wanted to. I thought it come, but it's like playing a game of Buzz. What's the Buzz Doctor called? But it's like playing a game of Operation. But you can check the transmission. So we'll be losing. How do I word this?